Welcome to the 14th Annual Ray Symposium. We're pleased to welcome nearly 700 colleagues who registered, colleagues and friends from around the country for this event. I'm Daniel Robinson, Dean of the College of Pharmacy at Western University of Health Sciences. The Ray Symposium honors Max Ray, MS, PharmD, Dean Emeritus of WesternU College of Pharmacy. As professor and dean from 1996 to 2006, he created a stimulating educational environment that fosters both excellence and professionalism. His professional career is divided almost equally into pharmacy practice, association management, and education. A major focus of his work throughout his career was seeking ways in which to improve the value of pharmacy to society, and I'm pleased to say he continues in that pursuit. I want to put out a special thank you to our sponsors for today's event, Blue Shield of California, California Pharmacists Association, Ralph's, and Ray Utani, DO PharmD. Thank you so much for your support, and thanks for those who have joined us today as sponsors. We have special guests whom I'd like to recognize. WesternU President Daniel Wilson is with us. Our Provost, David Barron. Linda Kranz is with us. She chairs our Board of Trustees, and with her are several members of our Board of Trustees. WesternU is a graduate health professions university with 9 colleges, and I'm pleased that I believe all 9 deans are with us for this presentation. Today's symposium is brought to you in a Zoom webinar format. As such, your microphones have been muted, and questions will be entertained at the end of the presentation. Please use the question and answer feature anytime during the talk to communicate your questions, and I'll do my best to get to as many of them as I can at the end. The chat feature has been disabled for this session. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker for the 2020 Ray Symposium, Katherine Eban. Katherine Eban is an investigative journalist, is a Fortune magazine contributor and Andrew Carnegie Fellow. Her articles on pharmaceutical counterfeiting, gun trafficking, and coercive interrogation by the CIA have won international attention and numerous awards. Her second book, Bottle of Lies, The Inside Story of the Generic Drug Boom, is a New York Times bestseller. Wired magazine listed it as one of the 12 science books that you should read right now. And New York Public Library calls her book one of the best books of 2019. According to David Dobbs' New York Times book review, Eban's gripping book shows how an industry founded to counteract big pharma is now uneasily merging with it, creating a two-headed monster whose tentacles ensnare the hapless victims and would-be regulators. Bottle of Lies is an invaluable expose, a repertorial tour de force, and a well-tuned epic. Educated at Brown University and Oxford, where she was a Rhodes Scholar, Eban lives in Brooklyn, New York, with her husband, 2 daughters, and a Newfoundland dog, Romeo. And now I give you Katherine Eban. Katherine, thank you.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Dean Robinson, it is an honor to have been selected to present this lecture, and I wish I could be with you all in person, which had been the initial plan. I never thought that I would miss being in an airport and on an airplane, but that is what this pandemic has brought us to. Anyway, I am really pleased to be able to discuss with you today my book, Bottle of Lies, The Reporting Journey, which was a decade long, and sort of lead you through what I uncovered and what that means for us, especially right now at this difficult moment. So the book that I'm going to talk about today is based on 10 years of reporting on 4 continents, interviews with over 240 people, including numerous whistleblowers, over 20,000 pages of internal FDA documents, so emails and memos, thousands of pages of internal corporate records, and 16 Freedom of Information requests. And I can tell you that you get much more information from the FDA if you actually sue them to get records, which I did in one of those instances. And along the way, I did numerous magazine articles. But the reporting for my book, let's see if I can, just one moment here. Sorry. The reporting for my book began in 2008. I got an unusual phone call, and I will say this, which is many of the most worthwhile investigative projects do begin with that important phone call. Somebody telling you that something is strange and should be looked into. And in this case, my phone call came from a fellow named Joe Graydon, who runs a radio program called The People's Pharmacy on NPR. Joe said that he was being flooded with complaints from patients about their generic drugs, that they didn't work properly or there were adverse side effects to those drugs. He thought that there was something significant about all those calls, and he had brought those complaints to the FDA. The feedback that he got from FDA officials was that it was probably psychosomatic. Patients were upset if their pills looked different or were a different color, and that was probably why they were reacting. So Joe is a trained pharmacologist, and he did not buy this. But what really stuck in my head is that he posed a question to me, and he asked me, what is wrong with the drugs? And it was a question that unfortunately I couldn't get out of my head because it took me about 10 years to try to answer that question. So I started looking into the regulation of generic drugs. And right away, some things jumped out at me. So first of all, the FDA recognizes that generics are not an exact copy. They are a version. So they provide a range for bioequivalence, that it has to fall not more than 25% above or 20% below the concentration in the blood of the brand name drug. And then if you impose a confidence interval on that, it comes a little closer into the center. But nonetheless, it is a range. And what I found is that doctors who prescribe narrow therapeutic index drugs, where precise dosing is very critical, noticed differences when their patients were switched between different generics. The medicine can have different ingredients, different excipients, and be absorbed at a different rate. So the rate of absorption was not part of the FDA's formula. But there was really one thing that struck me as most important, which is the FDA vets applications from companies by reviewing company data. They don't actually test the drugs, they review the data. That struck me as quite interesting and worthy of further investigation. Sorry about this, okay. It really struck me as an honor system. And if I had any doubt about whether in fact it was an honor system, I went down to FDA headquarters and I sat around a conference table with a number of FDA officials, including the head of the FDA's Generic Drugs Office, who said to me, the approval system requires the ethical behavior of the applicant. Otherwise, the whole house of cards will fall down, which just struck me as incredible. So, of course, the obvious next question is, well, what if the applicant is not ethical? My first article on this issue of generics and quality ran in June of 2009. It was easy to find patients who had complained. It was easy to find doctors who were concerned. And in fact, the article contains this quote from the president, then the president of the American Psychiatric Association. The FDA is satisfied that generics are okay. My question is, are we satisfied? But I will say this, from an investigative point of view, I was not satisfied. I remember Joe Graydon's question to me, what is wrong with the drugs? All I had been able to prove is that perhaps something was wrong, that patients were struggling and doctors were concerned. But why? What was wrong with the drugs? Well, as is often the case in reporting, you need to sort of put information out there to get information back. And my opportunity came about 1 month after I'd published that initial article. And I got this interesting email from someone calling himself $4 refill, which is, of course, what you would pay to fill a generic prescription at Walmart. $4 refill had some things that he wanted to tell me, and we got into dialogue. That was really when I began thinking about this issue in a different way. Basically, what $4 refill had to say was that if I really wanted to uncover the problem with generics, I needed to look where they were being made. The US drug supply is today 90% generic. The majority of those drugs are made overseas, largely in India and China. 40% of our generics are manufactured in India, and 80% of the active ingredient in all our drugs, brand or generic, are made overseas. Well, this really led me to a major reporting question, which is, how was I, as a journalist in New York, without a foreign news desk, without colleagues overseas, and without even a major source base overseas, how was I going to start reporting on companies in India and China? So as I began to talk to my sources in the US, I heard more and more about a company called Ranbaxy, which, that the name of that company was news to me, but apparently it was a household name in India. Ranbaxy was a source of national pride. It was one of the first successful multinationals in India, and it was one of the fastest growing generic suppliers in the US. Malvinder Singh, who subsequently became the CEO, was the grandson of the company's founder. And he was known for being very aggressive, and as he liked to describe it, taking risks. I didn't know what those risks were at the time, but I was going to find out. But I figured, just to back up, I will say this, which is, I am not a chemist or a pharmacist or a scientist. I have a master's degree in 17th century poetry, which has not really helped me in reporting this book. So one thing that I wanted to do as a journalist is, if I wanted to describe a process, I needed to learn how to do it. So how do you make a generic drug? I set out to learn that. This is a document from inside Ranbaxy that lays out the time frame for making a generic drug. And there's a process that can't really be circumvented. So you identify the product you want to make, you develop that product, you have these early batches small pilot batches, which you make in a lab, and you test for bioequivalence. Then you scale up the manufacturing. You go from exhibit batches to limited clinical trials, stability studies, and ultimately, the FDA likes to see 3 large commercial batches before filing what's called an abbreviated new drug application, or ANDA. So at the very least, that process can take 18 to 24 months, but it's really longer. It can be a number of years. The other thing that I did is I wanted to see how these drugs are actually tested in a laboratory. So I reached out to a laboratory in New Jersey that had a reputation for quality and asked for a tour, a visit. And what really struck me as fascinating is when I was there, the director of the lab mentioned to me as she was giving me a tour that whiteout was banned throughout the facility. That absolutely astonished me. Why would whiteout be banned? And what she told me is that because data is so sacrosanct and so critical to quality in manufacturing, whiteout could perhaps be seen as an invitation to tamper with data. So it was banned. So I kept that in mind. As I continued to report, I started to do what is, of course, a classic of investigative journalism. And as Woodward and Bernstein did, of course, I can't arguably compare myself to them, but indeed, I did begin to follow the money. So what I learned is that in generic drug manufacturing, there was an incentive that was created as part of early legislation, the Hatch-Waxman Act. And that incentive was called first to file. And it basically said, whatever manufacturer was first to file their ANDA application with the FDA, they would get 6 months of exclusivity on the market if their application was approved before other generic drug manufacturers came in. So to give you a sense of how much money that is, Ranbaxy, the Indian drug company, got a first to file exclusivity for generic Lipitor, and within 6 months made $600 million. So this was huge money, and everybody wanted to be first. That gave rise to craziness and mayhem in the FDA parking lot, because these companies would bring in their staff, bring them in stretch limos, or pitch tents in the parking lot of the FDA, literally sometimes waiting for weeks until a drug would go off patent and they could put down their ANDA to be first for that 6-month exclusivity. And I actually was able to uncover a memo, an FDA memo that describes the dangers of these tents and these waiting cars that were in the FDA parking lot. So the question was really, how could these companies be first? If they wanted that exclusivity, that first to file, how could they be first through the door? Well, excuse me. Let me, I began to hear about an investigation that the Justice Department and the FDA had ongoing into Ranbaxy. And the question that they were looking at was data integrity, whether Ranbaxy had potentially tampered with or altered quality data in order to be first through the door. So the whole game in this kind of manufacturing is how to shorten the timeline. If you have this inexorable timeline with these steps that you have to go through, how can you shorten it in order to be first in the parking lot? So the investigation, what I had learned into Ranbaxy, focused on whether the company had taken those early tests, those small, easy to control tests, and had tried to, through data manipulation, magnify them to make it appear that that data was part of larger scale manufacturing runs. So The problem is that as you scale up the manufacturing, the testing gets harder and harder to control. Drugs that might have been stable in the laboratory become unstable. And the data, you get out of specification problems, you get stability problems. But there was a question about whether what Ranbaxy was taking those early, easy to control data tests, those sets, and making them look like large scale manufacturing. I finally was able to sort of break the story of Ranbaxy open when I obtained a series of internal documents. And I will tell you that I have been an investigative journalist for 2 decades, but I have never seen a document like the one I uncovered with Ranbaxy. So there was a PowerPoint presentation that was put together by an employee who I'm going to introduce you to in a minute. And this PowerPoint spelled out the results of an internal investigation that the head of research and development commissioned. The head of R&D had come in from GlaxoSmithKline, had suspected that something was amiss with the data, had asked a subordinate to research the company's regulatory filings that it had submitted to regulators around the world to gain approvals. And this PowerPoint spelled out that Ranbaxy had falsified data for more than 200 products in over 40 countries. So basically a global crime spree, and had put this in writing, presented it to the board of directors. The board of directors had one question, which is, could this document be destroyed, and could they also destroy the computer on which the document was created? The employee who did the research and created that PowerPoint is a fellow named Dinesh Thakur. After this board meeting, Thakur was essentially forced out of the company. They planted porn on his work computer, accused him of watching that in his work hours, and forced him out of the company. He could not sleep at night once he left because he kept on thinking about the low quality of the drugs, particularly the drugs that were being distributed to Africa for the poorest AIDS patients who had little recourse. And we'll circle back to this question about drug quality, differing drug quality for different countries. But he created an email address, concealed his identity, and started contacting regulators around the world. He contacted European regulators, regulators in Britain, the World Health Organization, Brazil. To their credit, he contacted the FDA. No one got back to him. Finally, he sent this email directly to the FDA commissioner at that time, Lester Crawford. And basically it spelled out what was happening and said, I plead with you to put a stop to this crime. So this is the email that got the FDA to pay attention. He was contacted by somebody inside the FDA, and his information launched, remarkably, an 8-year investigation into what was happening inside Ranbaxy. So in May of 2013, I published a 10,000-word article in Fortune magazine that told the entire story of the criminal fraud at Ranbaxy and Dinesh Thakur's journey to uncover that fraud. So at this point that the article came out, 2 days earlier, Ranbaxy had pleaded guilty to 7 felonies related to faking data. But even after I published this article, I was mindful of Joe Graydon's question to me, what is wrong with the drugs? Now, I knew what was wrong with Ranbaxy's drugs, But what about all the other companies out there and the patients who had been taking other companies' drugs and had been writing into Joe Graydon? What was wrong with their drugs? So from a reporting standpoint, I was really left with a sort of a critical question. Was Ranbaxy just this outlier, the most corrupt drug company ever to operate? Or was it the tip of the iceberg? And a few things helped me as I began to examine that question. So a couple of months after my article ran, I got this email from a news source. This person was an FDA consultant who had worked overseas. And she basically said to me, you know, thank you for exposing the problem of fast drugs, which is essentially just like fast fashion. So what did she mean by that? So I think we all understand that if we go to a low-cost clothing store, let's say you walk into the Gap or Old Navy, and you go and you buy a pair of jeans, and they're very cheap. And we all understand why they're cheap, because they were probably made in a sweatshop overseas with poor working conditions and poor sanitation and mistreatment of its workers, etc. And whether it's right or wrong, many American consumers have accepted an essential bargain that we, in a globalized world, we realize major cost savings by buying goods that come from those distant sweatshops. But what this consultant was saying to me is there are pharmaceutical sweatshops as well. There are these distant factories that are not following good manufacturing practices, that are cutting corners, that are poorly operated, and they are making our low-cost generics. So that was really something for me to start to wrap my mind around. And with that sort of new idea in mind, I began looking into these manufacturing plants. So who goes into those manufacturing plants? Well, the good news is the FDA goes into those plants. So the FDA, their essential position is they inspect any plant where active ingredient or finished drugs are made for the US market, whether they're in, Cincinnati or in China. But right away, I uncovered some key differences in how the FDA inspects those overseas plants. So in the US, the FDA shows up unannounced, does inspections roughly every 2 years, stays as long as they need. But because of the logistical difficulties of doing overseas inspections, and by the way, since 2004, 2005, the FDA has had more inspections to do overseas than in the US. I discovered remarkably that the FDA would announce that it would be coming months in advance. It would tell the overseas plants, a date would be set, the FDA would ask those overseas plants to arrange ground transportation and hotels. The FDA investigators who show up are the invited guests of the plant, who help arrange for visas, create invitation letters. So what was happening in those plants, according to sources I began to develop, is that those inspections were essentially staged, and that the plants were operating data falsification teams that would arrive weeks in advance of the FDA's visit and start altering documents. They would backdate inspection records. They would just invent data. They would shred incriminating documents. But I also learned something else quite interesting. The inspections, what was happening with those inspections was essentially what my sources described as regulatory tourism. So if you're essentially asking these manufacturing plants to serve as hosts. Those plants would pick up the FDA investigators in luxury vehicles at the hotels. They would take them to hotels where their suites were magically upgraded. The FDA would never see a bill. They would arrange entertainment, shopping, trips to the Taj Mahal, offers of gold coins. And so the system of overseas inspections was having a corrupting effect on the FDA inspectorate. I learned that a new head, so did it have to be this way? It didn't. And in fact, the FDA ran a pilot program for a year and a half. This was under the leadership of a new director of the FDA's India office. He came in, he saw this whole system, and he said, this is ridiculous. We're going to go to unannounced inspections as the norm. We are not going to ask these plants to arrange travel. We're going to make all the arrangements through the US Embassy. And the idea was that the inspections would actually reflect true conditions at the plants. And lo and behold, in that time period, the FDA's most serious findings of official action indicated, which means this plant is really compromised, and until we see urgent changes made at the plant, we're going to restrict drugs from that plant from coming into the US. That's known as an import alert. Those serious findings increased by almost 60% under this program. So what that tells you is that the FDA was not previously seeing true conditions. Once they did unannounced inspections, they began to see what was really going on. What they uncovered was really remarkable. Essentially, it was a system under which the drug makers were making non-GMP drugs, drugs that were not made under good manufacturing practices. And they were selling them into developed markets as though they had followed all the rules. So essentially, they were undercutting their own products for profit and misrepresenting drug quality to regulators in order to win approval. And I really thought this was a very striking quote. I wanted to share it with you. It's from a lawyer at one of the companies who said to me, once you get to the point where you actually wholesale make up data points, hundreds and thousands of data points, what's to keep you from doing anything? Which I think is really gets to kind of the heart of how kind of perilous and compromised this system had become. So one of the things that was going on, so the manufacturing plants are required to share, to run a completely transparent system that is shared with regulators. So if an FDA inspector comes in, they need to have visibility into all the plant's data. So in other words, the systems, the tests, the data they're looking at reflect all the tests that the plants have done. But what some of these manufacturing plants were doing was creating hidden laboratories inside of the plants that operated non-networked HPLC machines. And this would allow them to run tests on samples of the drugs, figure out what the results would be. Would the drugs pass or would they not? And then if the drugs wouldn't pass, it enabled them to figure out how they could alter the test parameters to get passing results. So this is a picture from an FDA inspection of one of the hidden laboratories. And the FDA found this because there was a whistleblower inside the plant who had let them know, given them a heads up about this hidden lab. Really remarkable story. The FDA investigator told the plant manager, open up this door. There was this big bulky appliance, trying to conceal or cover the door. The plant manager said it was just a decommissioned lab. The FDA manager insisted, the FDA investigator insisted. Eventually, the door ended up getting broken down because the plant manager didn't produce keys. And inside of this hidden laboratory, they found an active computer that had up to the minute pre-tests of drugs that they were running to see whether the drugs would pass or not. Under the pilot program, they found remarkable conditions inside this laboratory, inside some of the plants. Here's a plant where, remarkably, they found a snake. This is a sterile laboratory in one of the manufacturing plants in India. This is a blood pressure medication that reached a retiree in New Jersey. And it comes from Dr. Reddy's, a manufacturer in India. And the retiree was about to swallow this capsule, which was part of her 90-day supply from Express Scripts, when she saw a flash of movement and found a live bug in the capsule, which tells you obviously something about the conditions inside the manufacturing plant where it came from. So in addition to the story of Dinesh Thakur, the book also chronicles the investigations of Peter Baker. He was an FDA investigator who figured out how to actually inspect these plants. So even if the inspections were announced in advance, instead of just asking the companies for printouts of data, he actually looked inside the computer systems of these plants. And by doing that, he found metadata from deleted tests, which pointed to the fact that they were pre-testing drugs in order to try to screen in advance for what the results would be. So over the course of 4 years, he inspected 86 plants in India and China and found evidence of fraud in 4/5 of them, which tells you something about the remarkably widespread nature of this kind of fraud. Also, there is no distinction between these plants, all kinds of plants, big, small, plants for global export, plants that made finished doses and active ingredient. He found fraud in so many of those. So here's something else really remarkable, which is, so from 2013 to 2018, FDA investigators were going into these plants in India and finding very serious conditions. And then they would recommend serious sanctions. So official action indicated being the most serious. But strikingly, FDA bureaucrats were taking those recommendations and downgrading them. So from official action indicated to voluntary action indicated, meaning that the downgrades essentially let these plants off the regulatory hook instead of continuing to manufacture and export. Instead of being restricted from exporting, they could continue to export. And I don't know if you've heard about the massive recalls of valsartan and losartan, which contained a carcinogen, but it was one of those plants in China where an FDA investigator recommended, official action indicated, that recommendation was downgraded, and for a whole other year, that plant continued to export API that had carcinogens in them. But take a look at these downgrades that the FDA did for Indian plants. So these are the India inspections and the India downgrades, US inspections and US downgrades. The result is the FDA only downgraded one inspection recommendation for the US in that whole period, and downgraded 109 inspections for India in the same period. So that really tells us, I think, that the FDA is protecting this flow of low-cost medicine from India even potentially at the expense of patients, because their own investigators are flagging problems there. And maybe we can talk about this a little bit more in Q&A. I realize it's a little bit complicated to explain. So what has the impact on American patients been from these kinds of problems? As the book documents, we know that generic drugs with toxic impurities, unapproved ingredients, dangerous particulates like glass fragments and metallic fragments, or that are not bioequivalent, have reached American patients, such as all those patients who were calling in to Joe Graydon's radio program. Just one example in the book, I focus on the Cleveland Clinic, where a very smart set of doctors began tracking problems with some of these drugs. So in 2013, they discovered that heart transplant patients who were fine on brand name Prograf, an immunosuppressant, had symptoms of organ rejection after they were switched to an immunosuppressant made by Dr. Reddy's laboratory, generic tacrolimus. Remarkably, a pharmacist at Loma Linda University Medical Center, which is in California, noted the same thing to the FDA, that only with the Dr. Reddy's brand of Prograf did they see inadequate immunosuppression and subsequent transplant failure. This really leads me to the conclusion that even though there is such a huge demand for these low-cost drugs, I think we need to contemplate whether there is a hidden cost to these drugs, right? You have patients with relapses, readmission, organ failure after transplants, and all of that, of course, comes with a huge cost, both for the patients and financial cost as well. Interestingly, after my book came out and the FDA posted this in January, they are now investigating the question of therapeutic inequivalence in tacrolimus. So I'm often asked, what are some of the most disturbing things that you found while you investigated this topic? And I would say one of the most dismaying things I uncovered is something called dual track production. So a number of these large generic companies actually manufacture different levels of quality depending on the market they're selling to. So they adjust the quality for less regulated markets. They decrease the quality because it saves on costs. So for the most regulated markets, which are the US and Europe, sometimes they have different factories or simply different production lines. And for the African market, where Dinesh Thakur was so worried about the quality of the drugs, for the Indian market, their own market, often they will make drugs with more shortcuts, impure ingredients. Remarkably, inside of Ranbaxy, when a scientist on a conference call brought up her concerns about the quality of the HIV drugs going to Africa, the medical director of the company said to her, "Who cares? It's just blacks dying," which is one of the more chilling quotes, I think, ever uttered by a drug company executive. But really at the heart of this was not so much prejudice, but a simple calculation that costs, money could be made, money could be saved by marketing worse drugs for what are called ROW markets, rest of world markets. Now these images come from a major manufacturer of generic drugs, but this is their plant for Indian and African patients. And you can see this is sterile, vats of sterile API with, in the blue circle, a monkey and bird droppings. And in fact, one of the things that the FDA uncovered, I will say, is there were manufacturing plants that were completely faking their sterility data. Their tests to make sure that the surfaces and the air and the water were sterile had wholly invented that data and were not testing anything at all. So the book came out in May. It became a New York Times bestseller. It got a huge amount of attention, remarkably in India, where it's marketed under a separate cover, a different cover and subtitle. It is the #1 bestseller. It focuses a lot on the Indian companies. There have been congressional inquiries about my findings, and the Indian government threatened action against the book, claiming that it was fiction-filled stories. And several months after the book came out, Malvinder Singh, who was the former CEO of Ranbaxy, was arrested for fraud. So I want to just quickly transition here, and I know we've got Q&A. Before this COVID-19 pandemic, the state of our drug supply, there was little incentive for quality. A global supply has made drug plants harder to police. We had a completely inadequate inspection system with an honor system of data review and pre-announced inspections, and an assumption that is really, I think, needs to be retired, which is that everyone cares equally about quality, which is clearly not the case. Fast forward to the COVID-19 outbreak, which I'm now reporting on, actually. And these are just some of my most recent articles. And the coronavirus has really exposed our profound dependence on these overseas drug companies, drug manufacturers, and the national security risks of that. I think you've all seen, the crisis unfolding of the FDA trying to source drugs, not being sure if they're going to have enough, escalating drug shortages, different countries clamping down on drug exports. India is just one example. And as I've recently reported, the FDA actually approving drugs from, for example, in Pakistan, where they've never even set foot in that plant. So, they can't inspect right now. They're dropping the quality. They're basically sort of allowing drugs to come in through emergency waivers from plants they've never set foot in, from countries where they've never inspected. So really, what can we do going forward? And in an ideal world, in a different world, and when we emerge from this outbreak, my list of proposals would be to make surprise inspections the world norm, to test all drugs, some system of testing at both the FDA and pharmacy level. Even if the FDA says the drug is fine, why don't CVS and Walgreens test the drugs they dispense, rather than just assuming that because the FDA has approved it, it's okay. Create incentives for quality in procurement guidelines, for formulary managers, not just based on the lowest cost, but cost paired with quality. We need a global cadre of investigators who can detect fraud. A lot of people have talked about the need for a global treaty to codify and enforce drug quality, just like we have global aviation treaties about how to safely navigate in the air, and those treaties leave each country responsible for their safety. But of course, ultimately, which is what I think may be starting to happen, bring back US manufacturing for critical drugs, which is so important right now when we find ourselves in this crisis. So that is a sort of outline of my findings, and I would welcome any questions. I'd be happy to answer them.
Katherine, thank you so much. That was just amazing. I did read the book, and there is so much more to it, and it really is an amazing and captivating read. One thing that caught me was sort of the cultural difference in the way regarding whistleblowers, and the fact that there was a lot of vertical a lot of people knew what was going on in a lot of these organizations, and they were all complicit. Whereas in the US, do you think, I think if mid-level workers knew that the bosses were cheating society, that they would probably blow the whistle and there'd be consequences.
Well, that is what a lot of my sources said to me, that, you know, first of all, when the FDA started investigating Ranbaxy, one of the things that confounded them is, how could you have a company where fraud is the business model, right? And hundreds of employees are in on it. The fraud was so widespread, and everybody inside the company sort of knew it. And, you know, their claim was, you couldn't do that in the US because you would have whistleblowers running to the FDA. So I think, you know, there is a difference when companies, and this is not in any way to say that Western manufacturing companies are free of fraud, because we certainly know that's not true. But there is some impact when companies have developed in highly regulated environments, where the companies fear regulators. They are concerned about whistleblowers. Whistleblowers have protections in the US that they don't. I mean, there's no protection in India for whistleblowers. So it's essentially a suicide mission, you know, in India to blow the whistle in the way that Dinesh Thakur did.
Right. Well, we have a number of questions. Victoria asked, is the EU also using medications from these generic companies, or do they have better methods of inspection?
No, this is really the world's drug supply. So the EU is pretty much operating with the same system that the FDA is. One possible distinction is that, but I haven't confirmed this, is I've been told that the EU does have more sort of systematic surveillance testing of drugs that are coming in through, you know, import. But it is really, this is a global system, so it impacts every market in the world.
John Jones, someone you know very well, I think.
Hi, John.
Asked the question, with the disruption caused by COVID-19 and your investigative findings, is there hope that political will move manufacturing back to domestic facilities as a matter of national security?
Well, that is just a huge discussion right now. And as one of my sources put it, you know, that effort has to be like a kind of Manhattan Project. It has to be that big to bring manufacturing back. But I think there are millions of dollars that were appropriated in one of the COVID-19 bills for a study of that very question. Basically, how are we going to bring manufacturing of critical drugs back to the US? So if ever there were a moment where that is on the table, I think it's now. Great.
As one of our participants asks, as pharmacists, we're trained to recognize and expected to look at all research for conflict of interest. Are there any conflicts that you would like to disclose, such as did brand name companies pay you to expose the generic companies?
That is a completely legitimate question, and it's one I've gotten often, which is why both on my website and in my in a reporting note in my book, I state very clearly that I've gotten no funding from Big Pharma of any kind. And I also state what the funding is for my book. It came from my publisher, HarperCollins, and as well from journalism grants from organizations that have no stake in the outcome of the book. Very fair question.
I would just add that Big Pharma is very much involved in the generic drug business.
Yeah, yeah, that's an important point to make, which is that, you know, it used to be that these sort of two industries or two sort of strains of the industry were very separate, but now brand companies are running generic companies, and also the brand companies are getting their active ingredient from many of the same plants that the generic companies are. So it's, you know, this is a global quality issue that I think can affect brand name drugs as well.
We have our participant asking, what can the average consumer do to protect themselves?
Yeah. So this is a question I've gotten the most since the book came out, and I wish I had a wonderful answer. I don't. But one thing I have done is I created on my website, which is katherineeban.com, a guide to investigating your own drugs. So it walks you through a number of steps that you can take. You know, the most basic being figure out who the manufacturer is of your drugs. I think, you know, of all of the people listening, I wonder how many people who take a monthly medication check the manufacturer of their drugs when they go to a pharmacy. I think many of us don't, because we have been told by the FDA that all the drugs are interchangeable, right? They're generic interchangeable with the brand and generic with generic. But once you begin thinking about that, you realize that may not be true. So it's very good to know if your drug is working, who made it and you want to stay on it, as opposed to if your drug isn't working, who made it and you want to get off of it. So the very first step is to know who's making your drugs.
Danielle asks, does the honor system for reviewing company data instead of doing independent review apply to US companies too? Or is it just for overseas company? I know you mentioned that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Essentially, you trust the manufacturer and their data.
Right. Right. Well, I think that's an excellent question. So, you know, they're just reviewing data for US companies as well. But I would say the key distinction there is that the vast majority of inspections in the US are unannounced, as opposed to the pre-announced overseas inspections. So if you have just a data review coupled with pre-announced inspections, you're essentially allowing the company to create a smokescreen.
Adriana asks, what do you recommend we do, as insurance companies typically only cover generic medicines?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that I just do as a consumer is to sort of shop for which generic I want. There are what are called authorized generics, and this is in my guide on my website. So authorized generics are something after a drug goes off patent, the brand companies often stay in the game by making their same drugs under a generic label. And those are called authorized generics. So it is possible as a consumer to seek those out, and that's essentially the brand name drug at a generic price.
Casey asked the question, will these slides be available after today's live session? And I can just say that we record for WesternU. We have an archive of our Ray Symposium that will be available through our website. Mm-hmm. So the presentation can be seen there, but it'll take a few weeks for that to actually be processed and up and available.
In the meantime, I will add that if you want to follow me on Twitter at Katherine Eban, I do have some of the images, the monkey, the snake, those images are up there, so you can find them on my Twitter feed.
Kenneth asks, it seems as if the FDA has regulatory oversight, but what is being done to hold them accountable?
Oh, what an excellent question. What is being done to hold the FDA accountable, as I
Right.
understand your question? Well, so this was, what started before this pandemic was congressional oversight. I mean, that's really the way that the FDA needs to be held accountable. So, Congress asking hard questions, and the GAO, which is the Government Accountability Office, I think is what it's, organization, probing questions like, why is the FDA downgrading so many of these inspections? What's going on? Why is that happening? So really, that's what we need here is congressional oversight.
Yeah, it's a very similar question, but what's the benefit to the FDA to allow these frauds to slide and these downgrades? I mean, what do they gain by doing that?
Okay, so I'm really glad that someone asked that question, which is that there is a tremendous, the FDA is under tremendous political pressure to make low-cost medicine available, right? And every time you have an inspection that's official action indicated, there's all kinds of restrictions and limitations that come with that designation. Basically what you're saying is the manufacturing plant is potentially dangerous, the processes in that plant are not under control, and there's probably going to be some kind of restriction of the product from those plants. So if the FDA has a political goal to keep these low-cost drugs flowing to as many Americans as possible, imposing sanctions on these plants is directly in conflict with that political goal, and I do believe that that's where a lot of the problem comes in.
And I think we'll probably have to cut it off after this question, but as a future prescriber, how would you suggest physicians prescribe generic medications safely for future patients?
That is an excellent question, and I hate to be the one suggesting that doctors worry about one more thing, because doctors have so much to worry about. But I do think that doctors, particularly doctors who prescribe narrow therapeutic index drugs, they need to not just diagnose their patient, but they sort of need to diagnose the drug supply. Dr. Harry Lever at the Cleveland Clinic began to notice patterns for his patients where they had been stabilized and then they were unstable. So, a question that needs to enter a doctor's mind is, why did that happen, and was it related to a medication change? I think one very important possible reform is to have doctors notified of manufacture changes in their patient's medication. Or maybe there would be a system where if a doctor requests it, they can be notified of that. But it's just something that doctors, I think, need to think about.
I have to ask one more question because this is from our president of the university. He's asking if, while we focused a lot on problems in India,
Mm-hmm.
Do we have the same problems essentially in China?
Yes. The answer is essentially yes. So the book does chronicle, while the book, the sort of narrative core of the book is Dinesh Thakur's story and what happened in Ranbaxy, it does also have material from China. Peter Baker found the same kinds of problems in China. So this is definitely a global issue of low-cost markets, essentially gaming high-cost markets.
Well, with that, I want to thank you so much for the amazing presentation. We had, by my count, over 642 participants in this webinar, and I think everybody enjoyed it. And there were certainly a lot of questions that weren't answered. But I would highly advise, I think in our chat room, you can find a link to our WesternU bookstore if you'd like to purchase the book. And of course, it's available through other sources as well. But Katherine, thank you so much. And thank you for your time. And be safe in New York. All right. We're thinking about you, and as we take care of ourselves. So,
thank you so much. It was such a pleasure and an honor to share this time with you, and I wish everybody good health.
With that, thank you to all of our participants and everybody who registered and enjoyed the meeting. Can't thank you enough, and we'll do this again next year. How about that? All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Dean Robinson. That's a wrap.